welcome to the Kongversation. I'm Hyle Russell.
And I'm Josh Wallen.
Josh, hi. How'd you get in here? I was quarantined with Jeff, and now you're in here? This isn't right. Stay 6 feet away from me, Josh. Where's Jeff? Is Jeff okay?
Dude, I'll tell you what, I will stay in a completely different room from you, okay?
All right.
I'll stay in the bathroom.
Oh no, you're not stealing my toilet paper, my precious toilet paper.
Damn it, he's on to me.
No, of course we're in separate establishments. We're in separate states right now.
Separate bunkers.
Yes, we are social distancing, as we always like to do in the collective DK Vine Geek Critique empires. This is the Kongversation. This is week 72 of the quarantine, and we are trying to stay sane. So, Josh, you approached me the other day. You're like, "Hey, I got an idea for a conversation," and I was like, "Great! That means I don't have to come up with an idea for the next one," and so that's why you're here.
And my idea was, what if instead of doing a Donkey Kong podcast, we did a Sonic podcast? As it always is.
Yeah, well, I'm burying the lead there. I have Donkey Kong on the key art. Promoted it mostly as Donkey Kong. We'll talk about Sonic and Donkey Kong. How about that? I think you just wanted to talk about Sonic with somebody. And you're like, how can I manipulate somebody to talk to me about Sonic the Hedgehog for at least 90 minutes in this quarantine state that we're living in?
Well, it's like I'm burning out my own Discord server on it. I'm burning out my Twitter account.
Yeah.
I'm sure as hell burning out Alicia. I've got to find another outlet to talk about Sonic the Hedgehog.
Well, you found one. So we'll talk a little bit about Sonic here, and we'll talk a little bit about Donkey Kong, which is a new topic for us. I guess I should get through some due diligence, and obviously I know times be tough, and so I feel guilty about even bringing it up. But DK Vine is on Patreon, and it's helping to keep this empire afloat. I call it an empire. It's really not. It's a house of cards, and we wouldn't be able to do this without all of our lovely, lovely patrons. And I finally got the issue with the stickers sorted out, because we had some printing issues this time around with our Patreon stickers, but it's finally sorted out. So I should hopefully get those out. I've got stamps already, so I don't even have to go to the post office to get these out. So every patron, the $1 and up, you just have to give us $1 a month. You get your DK Vine stickers, and they'll be going out finally. Sorry about the delay there, but you'll get everybody's favorite characters like Daisy Kong, Naughty Witch, and Wasp Lady. So there you go. Those are the $1.
I always thought it was weird that the plot of Donkey Kong Land had you rescuing Daisy Kong instead of Candy. Just like, it seems so arbitrary.
See, the joke there is that, and this is actually relevant to what we're discussing a little bit on this episode. The joke is that post buyout, after Rare went off with Xbox, Nintendo Power, which was I remember. Yeah, this. For those of you who don't know, because we have a worldwide audience, Nintendo Power was the North American Nintendo propaganda magazine. Officially endorsed by Nintendo of America, but they did this abrupt 180 on Donkey Kong Country after the buyout, and started shit talking it in their magazine, and they got really weirdly passive aggressive about it, and even started referring to Dixie Kong on more than one occasion as Daisy Kong, and like, to this day, I don't know if that was just born out of ignorance, or if it was just them being, like, casually dickish about, it's not worth knowing, just Daisy Kong, whatever. But
I mean, I've got to assume that it was just ignorance. I mean, you've got to remember this is the same Nintendo that just a few years ago spelled the snake's name wrong. spelled Radley's name wrong in Super Mario Odyssey.
Okay, actually, though, funny thing about that is Radley was also spelled wrong in Rare's Banjo-Kazooie because Radley is one of the incorrect choices in Grunny's Furnace Fun for, I believe, the name of Hissed Up the Snake. So there is actually a tradition of misspelling Radley's name. So I like to think that Super Mario Odyssey was just continuing that tradition rather than it being a typo. So anyway.
And for the sake of the cohesiveness and the peace of these disparate fandoms, I commend your ability to see it that way.
I've mellowed. Once upon a time, I was not a mellow gentleman that I am today. Once upon a time, Josh, I had lots of angst about what I felt like at the time was my childhood not only being taken from me, but also being spat upon and kind of trampled in the dirt a bit. Which, come to find out, and this isn't something I realized until I got older, happens to everyone. It happens to everyone when they hit that awkward period in their early 20s, maybe a little bit earlier than that for some, but whenever the generational shift happens in pop culture, it leaves nothing unscathed. And that's what we're discussing on this episode. This is actually a really fascinating topic to me. It's something that I've kind of been really obsessed with for a good 15 years or so. It's a more sociological kind of way of looking at video games, but not just video games, really pop culture, nerd culture. Anything people are really into will be affected by this at one time or another, unless it's something... Actually, I can't even think of anything that hasn't been touched by this.
Well, I think it also, and I just want to say that, like, one of the biggest reasons, and I told you this on Discord before we did this, like, one of the biggest reasons that I came to you specifically with this idea was because I know that you are, like, also into this kind of thing. You are also the kind of person who will, you know, go on Wikipedia binges and read about the history of things that that you yourself aren't really interested in.
Yeah.
And like me, you're the kind of person who, like, finds the concept and the evolution and the effects and the waves, and you find fandom inherently fascinating, even if it's not your own fandom.
Sure. Yeah, because I can empathize with other fandoms through the prism of my own. And of course, my own is the Donkey Kong universe. So, like, even if it's something completely tonally different from my own, if I see a super fan of something, I can relate to them. And I think this pain that we're discussing on this episode is something that everyone will go through at one point or another if they remain a fan of their property, their franchise, whatever it is. And
we should say also, if the thing that you grew up being a fan of and the thing that you grew up loving is, like, lucky enough that it continues to, like, persist, like, past your childhood.
Right. And I mean, these days, really nothing goes away. Like, because we have 30 different streaming services at this point. We have consolidated like corporations. There are really only 3 corporations now. So, like, everybody owns everything, and there's millions of hours of content that needs to be filled or product to be put on the shelves. So there is like, unless it's something like from so long ago, like an old comic serial strip from the 1910s, you know, that probably won't get revived, but anything
that people remember will be brought back.
I would say,
I thought I was...
Anything from the last 40 years will definitely be brought back at some point.
Like, Commander Keen fans, for example, probably thought they were safe. The last real game came out in 1991. It seemed like nothing would ever happen again, and then they bring it back as a fucking mobile game and piss everyone off all over again.
Recently, this is closer to DK Vine's territory. The Pendragon series, which Rare made 4 of those games when they were Ultimate Play the Game. And they were not included on Rare Replay, so like almost completely forgotten about. And now it's been incorporated into Sea of Thieves' ongoing narrative as kind of a sequel. So like they brought back the character of Pendragon in Sea of Thieves. So now Sea of Thieves has kind of become the 5th game in the Pendragon series. So yeah, like even something like that last game was in the 80s, right? So it's been 30 some years, and now here we go. This big high profile return.
Yeah, and I want to say before we get into this here that, you know, I hope everybody's doing like really, really well. I checked the calendar and we have officially been quarantining for exactly 1 month now.
Oh. What have you... I'm trying to think the right way to phrase this. It doesn't seem flippant. Do you go through like multiple periods in any given week where you feel like you've got it, where you're like, oh, this is it, I've got COVID, and then you it passes, like the feelings pass after like maybe 12 hours, and you're like, I'm a dick. Why did I ever like think I had it while people are actually suffering out there?
No, I would say that like I've been doing my I've been doing my best to just. I guess I've been pretty good at compartmentalizing that for myself. Like, I figure that I'm doing all, you know, I feel like I'm doing everything that I can do, and we're doing everything that we can do to stay safe. Sure. And, you know, I'm my biggest concern with this is that, like, my parents, who are both, you know, getting fairly up there at this point, and, you know, my dad is a cancer survivor. Yeah. So, you know, I'm really like that. That's more where my worries with this lie. I would say, but
and you know, like my parents, I've had like long discussions on the phone recently. I've talked to them more than I've talked to them probably in years, trying to convince them to take this seriously because they get fed some misinformation.
As happens.
Yeah, so it's like, how is this on me? You know, to make sure they understand that, like, I feel like now I'm the parent, and I am like, am I really at that age where I am now the caretaker for them? Oh my God. But yeah, I mean, luckily they do seem to get it. And like, I have 95-year-old grandparents, and so it's just like. And then my grandmother had a stroke the other week, and then they discovered lung cancer in her, and so it's just like, really? Now? Like, it just...
Jeez.
Yeah, so it's been a stressful time, but yeah, turns out...
Alicia hurt her ankle a couple days ago, and
no.
Like, you know, it's fine, she just sprained it, but like, there for a second we were both just like, oh god, we don't want to go to a hospital, we don't want to have to like go to a doctor's office right now.
Right, yeah, and I caught a cold like late last week, so
oh geez,
really bad cold too. But for a day or two, I thought, this is it, I've got it, I've just got to ride it out, and now the symptoms have already cleared up. So it's just fun times.
I'm very glad to hear that.
Yeah,
but what I would say I've noticed with myself is just that, like, weirdly, like, you know, working from home, I'm you know, a bit of a hermit anyway. Like, I think that's one reason that this has been at least a little bit, like, if I went, like, I think it's been a little bit easier for me to adjust to, just because I have days sometimes where I just stay home all day and don't go anywhere anyway.
Yeah.
So it's like, I'm just having a whole bunch of those and nothing else. Weirdly though, I feel like my conversational abilities, like, you know how like, if you don't use a skill, it starts to atrophy. And, you know, despite the fact that I've got Alicia here, and of course we talk and we hang out, but like, as far as like my ability to be social, or to Like, it's weird because I've always considered myself an extrovert, but lately it's just seemed like it's been a little harder to get into that gear, and I think it's just because I haven't, like, had to use it as much as I normally do.
Yeah, I'm an introvert who has to really turn it on to be an extrovert. So I'm like faking it, and so it is a challenge for me. Like I would say, yeah, like conversations. That's definitely something. Like, thankfully, I do this podcast, so that keeps me sharpish there. Really, the only skill that's really atrophied is using toilet paper, wiping. I don't remember what that's like. I just use pine cones now.
Well, all you have to do is just get in the shower and just rinse off after. Okay, we could probably stop now.
That's what people say, and I'm just like, really? Like I can understand if you have a bidet, but that, I don't know. That's
not everybody is lucky enough to live next to the woods, Hyle.
I mean, I don't know what I'm reaching for in there. It's a pine cone, a dead squirrel, whatever I can get at this point. Times be tough, as I said. So,
now, if you do happen to find a dead squirrel, though, you can whack yourself in the head with it, and it'll make the Game Boy screen look like it's in color.
Oh, nice, yeah. Well, the problem with the dead squirrels is if, they just turn in another tail, and then they're back, and then it gets really awkward.
See, and that's very appropriate because you went I went for the deep Sega cut, and you went for the deep DKU cut, and that's exactly what we're here to talk about.
The thing is, I understood your reference because the Sega commercials when I was a child, and I'm pretty sure I've discussed this with you, they would irritate me and piss me off. I would feel like I was being bullied by Sega for being a Nintendo child. So I remember those commercials, and I'm like, how dare they bully me on my own TV? I'm watching cartoons right now, and they're making me feel bad about myself.
Man, that's like what the console wars were all about back then, though. Like the term war was there for a reason. That's look at these idiots over here playing Nintendo games.
Yeah, I remember the one where like they showed some racing game on the Genesis, and then they compared it with Super Mario Kart, which was like in this like very slow moving like buggy or something, and it was just like, man. But then Donkey Kong Country came out, and it was just like, yeah. How do you like us now, Sega?
And interestingly, and I think this sort of ties into what we're talking about, I've been listening to a podcast. I mean, I've been listening to this podcast for like 13 years now, but it's called Retronauts. Mm-hmm. And it's done by a man named Jeremy Parrish, he was kind of like, when you and I talk about like NES kids and the generation that grew up with the NES and the way that they just didn't get it, man. They didn't get Sonic the Hedgehog. They didn't get Donkey Kong Country. They thought that Play It Loud was pandering. Like, he is kind of like one of the first, like, cause he worked for OneUp.com in like the early 2000s and, has had all kind, like he is a brilliant guy, knows video game history. He has explained the appeal of NES games in a way that I could never personally get to because I wasn't experiencing them in real time. But like, he's kind of one of the people that I think about. And I think I was listening to an episode with him a while back, and they were talking about the Play It Loud ad campaign as if it was just this, they gave in to what Sega was doing. They abandoned the way that Nintendo had always been. And, it's funny to see the disparity between how we remember that versus how they remember it.
Because DK Vine views it with reverence. Exactly. Oh man, like that was the era. And it's funny because I don't know if you've read Console Wars, which is a great book. I definitely recommend anybody who's interested in this era, this like early to mid 90s era of Nintendo versus Sega. But like they get into the Play It Loud marketing ad campaign and the relief that Nintendo felt when they finally started it. It's just because I believe one of the quotes, and I don't know, I forget from whom, but it was just, finally we're doing something to fight back against Sega rather than just taking it on the chin. So Yeah, it's funny how you can be a fan from one era and view something with such disdain that came after your prime. But in this case, your prime is when you're a certain age, and I would argue that age would be roughly 12 years old. That is when I think you're at the peak of loving the way particular pop culture is around you. And that is when
I think also, at least for me at that age, I was somewhat more open to new experiences in gaming at that time, which sounds like I'm dunking on myself now, but it's really just, I feel like it's more like my preferences were not so, like, rigid as they are now. I didn't really have as much of an idea of what I wanted out of a game.
That's right.
And therefore, it was much easier for me to go, okay, well, let's try this and approach it with an open mind.
Because I played everything back then. I rented everything from Blockbuster Video, right? So, like, a new game came out, I would play it. I might not buy it, but I would definitely give it a try. And yeah, it's when you're still like forming who you are as a person, and you're much more susceptible to everything's influence as a result. And then things kind of calcify, they solidify into the person you're going to be as a teenager and a young adult, and then you can kind of get into this rigid state of thinking right when the world changes underneath your feet. And this is what happened to me. I think from your experiences, it sounds like it might have happened to you, with our respective franchises. But it's funny because when I say our respective franchises, I'm, of course, to me, referring to Donkey Kong, but the shift with Donkey Kong to an earlier generation had already happened. And I was the usurper. I was part of the crowd that was ruining what they loved. And I would have never considered that, you know? So that's what we're discussing on this episode. We're discussing the generational shifts that happen within a franchise when what is no longer the status quo, and things adapt to what's currently in vogue or to the taste of a new generation, and how we deal with that as fandoms.
And how we deal with that when, like, I think more, like, just as much as anything else, how we deal with it when long-held beliefs or conventions, or, like, when, I guess, how do I put this? When the common knowledge of what we in the fandom think of something suddenly starts to shift, and it starts to shift because the generation behind us starts to grow up and get online and join the conversation, and to them, this is just the way it's always been.
Yeah. Well, and a couple things can happen too. Like, the generation behind us kind of takes control, but the generation ahead of us also kind of gets into positions of power where they can influence things to their liking, which is usually the way it was when they were a kid before our generation. So there is what I refer to as the generational tug of war that transpires, and it honestly it happens to everything. And yet people are blind to it. I see it happening with Star Wars now. Like, it's just, I see all these, like, prequel fans, like, aghast at the sequels, and then the original trilogy fans who hated on the prequel, and it's just like, you can't see this? Like, oh, okay, but we're gonna keep this.
Like as an example of a fandom that I'm totally outside of, the probably one of the most interesting ones to me is Teen Titans. Like, Teen Titans, I believe, was a comic book that started in the 80s, and in 2003 they came out with this this goofy they made this goofy cartoon out of it on Cartoon Network. And there were forum posts back then of these older fans just being like, how could they do this? How could they so misrepresent Teen Titans? But like Teen Titans there for a while, I believe, was basically like a Power Rangers level phenomenon among kids.
Yeah.
In the early 2000s.
Yeah, so like,
and I think
I remember, because, you know, I was a DC Comics kid growing up, and so like I remember, like, because you had the DC animated universe, like shows like Batman the Animated Series all the way through Justice League, and that kind of set the standard and the tone for what people expected. And then Teen Titans came along, and that older crowd hated it. They hated it, and then and then Teen Titans kind of ran its course, and then they started the new Teen Titans show, Teen Titans Go, I believe.
Right, that's what it's called. Yeah.
Yeah, and then the Teen Titans crowd, who are now like older, hated on that because it was too silly.
Yeah, and it's like, it's just, and I'm not saying, like, you know, I think I watched a little bit of Teen Titans at the time, and you know, I liked it just fine. I'm not saying that, like, anybody involved in any side of this debate was, like, wrong or ridiculous. It's just, it's fascinating to see how much these things go in cycles.
Yeah, and that's
like,
exactly it. Yeah, it's
same as it ever was, you know?
Right. But we're going to try to keep it focused as best we can on our two respective franchises, Donkey Kong and Sonic the Hedgehog. So
and when we say focused as best we can, we will be here for 5 hours.
No,
So settle in.
I'm getting over my fake COVID, my coronavirus, faux Rona. See what I did there?
Nice.
So I'm on the mend, so I will not be here for 5 hours. I'm gonna go to bed. You can keep going, Josh. I'll keep the stream going. We'll keep Audacity rolling, but no, I'll let you kick us off because you're the one who brought this topic to my attention. So I'll let you explain the premise.
All right. So when you say, like, you know, our respective fandoms, like, the one thing about that is that, like, Sonic may be my favorite thing, but, like, Donkey Kong Country is, like, I feel like it's almost just as much of my favorite thing as Sonic is. It's sometimes less of a, like, number 1 and number 2 situation and more of, like, a 1A and 1B. And given that's how I feel about, like, that's how much I like both of these properties, it's kind of interesting to me that it took me so long to make this connection in the first place. So here's the premise. At the end, like, right at the end of the 90s, in 98 and 99, the Sonic franchise went through something of a soft reboot. And I feel like I should clarify, like, this probably wasn't so much of an intentional reboot because, like, at least not from the perspective of, like, Sonic Team itself, the developers of the games. But the problem, like, I think from their perspective, especially at this time, Sonic Adventure 1 was just as much, it was perfectly in continuity. They intended it to be perfectly in continuity with everything that came before. They saw it as a direct continuation of Sonic 1, Sonic 2, Sonic 3, Sonic & Knuckles, Sonic Adventure. I think that's always how they saw it. The issue was that from the very, very beginning of the franchise, going all the way back to 1991, Sega of Japan and Sega of America had rather different ideas about how to portray the series and its continuity, and even to a degree the personalities and style of its characters. And this was actually very intentional. At the time, you know, in the pre-internet age, especially when marketing a series that's primarily for kids, you know, this was something you could get away with. Like, Sonic in Japan could be explicitly set on Earth with like on a version of Earth with, like, you know, they were tacit, they never appeared, but you got the impression that there were humans there besides Eggman. His greatest rival was called Dr. Eggman, whereas Sonic in the US could have his arch nemesis known as Dr. Robotnik, and could be on an alien planet called Mobius. And like this was like Sonic was immediately thrust into this like cavalcade of alternate continuities. Like in the 90s, there were like by the time I got into the series in 1994, there were already at least 4 or 5 different continuities that were all wildly incompatible with each other, between comic books and different cartoons, and just the regional variations between the series. So I think, to me, as like growing up with that, and like even like, you know, watching the 2 cartoons that were both on the air at the same time, that aside from both of them having Sonic and Tails in them, they tonally and in terms of story had almost nothing to do with each other, except that Jaleel White played Sonic in both of them. But like, it was very easy for me to, like, I think I was already primed to see any new version of anything that looked like it might be a different Sonic as, like, well, this is just another new continuity, and I was very accepting of that. This is just a new canon. This is just a new universe. The comic books at the time even had something called the Cosmic Interstate, that Sonic could run along and access different versions of like, his continuity and of, like, brand new continuity, like, new continuities that weren't like otherwise official. So while the developers didn't consider Sonic Adventure 1 to be might not have considered it to be a reboot, I think I did, and I think to a degree a lot of the fandom did. And a big part of that was just the character designs changed quite a bit with Sonic Adventure. This was done primarily to make the characters look better in from a 3D perspective. Sonic was given longer limbs and like longer spines to give him like more distinction when you're looking at him from behind, and green eyes. The characters now had like voice acting, and there was a greater focus on story. There were multiple gameplay styles, because like, whereas before Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles would all play pretty similarly to each other, they just had, you know, different abilities. Now, like, their levels were different, the focuses of their goals were different. I should also note that the character designs were updated to be somewhat more contemporary. Like, I look at Sonic Adventure artwork, and it just screams late 90s attitude to me. It was very, very contemporary of the time. And even though that, like, at the time, like, Sonic Adventure, despite how poorly it's aged now, and how difficult it can be to go back to, especially, or even to pick up and play if you never have before now, because like a lot of early 3D games, it sort of exhibits all the experimental sort of, like, the polish that would come, that we would find in 3D gaming hadn't been realized yet in 1998. People were still figuring it out. But, so yeah, while Sonic Adventure might have been well received at the time, the series, as it went on over the next 5 or 6 or 7 years or so, kept going more and more in that direction. It got more serious. It got more story focused. It got more realistic. It focused more on Sonic's, on like a version of Sonic in the real world. It incorporated more and more what I would say were poorly executed anime tropes.
Yeah, I remember a few of them from watching your excellent series.
Yes. And another, like, this I would say was more of a sticking point for people looking at it outside the fandom, but it kept introducing more and more and more characters. Like a new Sonic game would come out, and there would just be like, okay, here, like, Sonic Adventure 1 was again sort of the starting point of all this, that introduced Big the Cat and E102 Gamma, and a fishing mini game, and then you had Sonic Adventure 2, Shadow the Hedgehog, Rouge the Bat, Eggman has a grandfather now. And like Sonic Riders introduced this group called the Babylon Rouges, which were 3 birds on extreme airboarding gear. And like as it kept like I said, Sonic Adventure was sort of the starting point of this trend, but as the series went on, the trend the series dug itself more and more into that trend. It went further and further in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what started happening is that by the time of the totally infamous and deservedly so Sonic 06, that game's failure, and that game, like everything about that game represented the very worst of Sonic Adventure. Sonic 06 was like taking Sonic Adventure and like basically putting all of its worst aspects on steroids. And what kind of ended up happening was that meant that all of those aspects, even though Sonic Adventure was well liked at the time, those aspects reflected poorly on that entire era. And in particular, the redesigned characters, the focus on story, the amount of new characters that were being introduced, having multiple playstyles besides just playing as Sonic, sort of the seriousness of taking Sonic and his stories and his world very seriously. Like what started as, a pretty natural feeling evolution of the Genesis games eventually turned into just a completely over the top parody of like, what if Sonic was real? Like it almost reminds me of that Power Rangers fan film from a few years ago where it just imagined Power Rangers as like an R-rated action movie.
Yeah. Yeah, so basically what you're saying is just escalation.
Yes.
As it went on, they just kept piling on what were small elements, and then it just kept like building and building and building until we got to that point, Sonic 06, where it was just a complete cacophony of, from a certain point of view, nonsense.
Yeah. Like, Sonic 06 is probably to this day, like especially at least for the last 15 years, the most important game that came out. The most important Sonic game that's happened in the last 15 years is Sonic 06, because it's defined everything that's happened to the series in the last 15 years. Namely, that Sega has just been absolutely terrified to ever make anything like that again. Like I said, it's solely to the reputation and the. I mean, not that like the thing is the adventure games were aging poorly already anyway, so that didn't help things. But it's solely the reputation of that whole era, and led to this era where, like, very, very few of those elements have been reincorporated, and when they have, it's almost done with this very light touch, with this very, like, they're afraid to get too close to it or really go all in on it. And I think that especially after 06, this was growing out like throughout this whole era, but 06 was really the sticking point. It was really the breaking point. It was really the point where even most Sonic fans were able to step back and go, okay, this really is going too far. And it reflected poorly on like everything that had been being done in that entire era. At least among a certain, older proportion of, like, section of the fandom. And we'll get into this a little more later, but I want to try to avoid generalizing groups of fans too much.
Okay.
But basically, certainly to me at the time, the feeling was, and then this happened. And then, like, Sega did one of the most tone-deaf things they possibly could have done at the time. They announced a game called Sonic the Hedgehog 4.
Oh.
And the reason that, like, this was in, like, 2009, maybe early 2010, that we got wind of this. That, like, basically after Sonic 06, Sega just was like, push everything that we've been doing off the table. Like, flip the table, go back to basics, get a clean slate, reviewers at the time were all saying, man, Sonic just doesn't work in 3D. Sonic has never worked in 3D. It's never been good in 3D. So Sega was like, okay, we'll go back to the original style. We'll go back to 2D. We'll give you Sonic the Hedgehog 4. And Sonic the Hedgehog 4 was a 2D Sonic game that in no way lived up to the pedigree of its name. I don't think it was really a god-awful game. It wasn't broken. It wasn't horrible. It wasn't the worst thing in the world, but it did not, like, when you call it Sonic 4, people are going to be expecting Mega Man 9, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And instead, it kind of, like, in terms of its gameplay, it very much missed the point of what the Genesis games were going for. And it included, despite being called Sonic 4, it had 2.5D graphics and included the modern, longer-spined, green-eyed version of Sonic.
The longer-spined is such a weird descriptor. I mean, I know what you mean, but that is just such a weird descriptor to refer to someone as. It's just like, oh, he's got really good chiropractic care now. Like, what? I don't need to shame him.
See, that's great. I love that you laugh at you laugh at that, because, like, to me, it's just such a regular thing. It's just such a regular way to describe things. It's very normal for me.
I mean, I guess the equivalent in our fandom might be like, or an equivalent would be like the toothy grin jackass descriptor when it comes to Donkey Kong, like
ponytail twirl. Helicoptery tail thing, you know?
Right.
But anyway, I think Sonic 4 was the point where a significant portion of the fandom was really like, okay, enough of this. We want the old Sonic back. We want the Sonic that we grew up with back. We want the Genesis, the Mega Drive. We want the classic, shorter, stubbier, fatter, black-eyed Sonic back. And lo and behold, we actually got it. like somehow it surprised me even at the time that it actually happened. We actually just passed the 9-year anniversary of the reveal of a game called Sonic Generations, which made this distinction official between modern Sonic and classic Sonic. Maybe they're two separate characters. Maybe classic Sonic is the younger version of modern Sonic. That's been pretty nebulous across different mediums, but regardless, there were now two separate Sonics. And I think for a while it seemed like things were pretty peaceful and people were pretty happy, and more importantly, like the games were things were actually on an upward trend there for a while in terms of like the quality of like the games. After Sonic 06, Unleashed came out. Colors was generally considered an improvement on Unleashed. Generations was generally considered an improvement on both of them. And, I mean, the future looked pretty rosy. But I'm going to, for the most part, abandon now my complete walkthrough of the Sonic franchise. and sort of fast forward to the past year or so.
I mean, I appreciate the history, because this is like going on a Wikipedia binge, except I don't have to do the reading. It's being read to me like a bedtime story.
Well, I hope you're enjoying it. I hope just as importantly the listeners are enjoying it, because I feel like I've been going for a while. Like if there's anything I'm not explaining well, or that you think needs more clarification, please let me know, because like I said, this stuff is kind of it's like the back of my hand for me, you know?
It's just like watching one of your videos, except you didn't have to do any intensive editing, so...
Well, I hope so. And I didn't have to, like, meticulously script anything either.
Yeah, there you go. You see, you can just do these ad-lib. You don't even need to write anything.
So that brings me to, I would say, the past year and a half. What I started noticing... And this has sort of sent me on an intellectual and sociological journey that I think is ultimately helping me become a better, more well-rounded, kinder fan. At least that's the hope.
Sure.
Because about a year and a half ago, I started seeing people come out of the woodwork who seemed to have this irrational, what seemed to me to be an irrational, like, over-the-top vitriol for these newer Sonic games. Even the ones like Colors and like Generations that had always seemed to me to be just extremely well regarded, and in some cases, especially those ones, they would just they would trash on them and talk about them like they couldn't believe that anybody would ever find this acceptable or good. And what I've tried to do, and I admit that I haven't always been the best about this. Several months ago, like I would say back at the beginning of the year, I was dealing with some health issues, which were nothing major and nothing permanent, but like I wasn't feeling like I wasn't like in the best way I could be physically, and just I think the stress of that and the amount of doctor's visits and the amount of antibiotics I was on was kind of affecting my ability to sort of handle things and approach things with an even hand. And I think what I started doing was kind of taking some of this stuff a little too personally. And while I never went like over the top, I don't think I ever got too into the weeds with it. I was sort of portraying, I was basically sort of attacking certain ideas in the, like, certain elements of the Sonic franchise instead of lifting up the parts that I did like, if that makes sense.
It makes complete sense to me. Please.
Yeah.
Continue.
And it was like what I've been doing is trying to sort of ascertain where these people are coming from, why they feel the way that they do about things, and to kind of figure out, like, okay, well, what do they like and what do they want and where are they coming from? And what I've tried increasingly to become curious about that sort of thing and not judgmental.
Mm-hmm. And
I just think that's a much healthier way of approaching it, and I've talked directly to quite a number of these people, and, you know, sometimes you get into a conversation with somebody, and it's like, okay, this person's just determined to lash out, they're just determined to be angry, they're not gonna, like, they're gonna scream their perspective and not listen to anyone else's, and that's fine, but the majority of the interactions I've had have been really positive. And and what I've come to realize is that, and not that I didn't know it on some level before, but this whole quote-unquote dark age period of the Sonic franchise, that part of it that gaming journalists and older fans alike came to think of as this horrible time that almost killed the franchise, that era did not stop attracting new fans. Sonic Adventure 2 Battle in particular was the best-selling third-party game on the GameCube, if memory serves. And in the past couple of years, the kids who grew up with that version of the character have come of age, and of course, just like we always did, they too have a great deal of reverence and nostalgia for everything that they grew up with. And, you know, so it makes even more sense here, because if this period of time is known as this horrible, dark, awful time for Sonic, like, man, it barely survived this. God, I'm sure glad we weren't there. We're not there anymore. I'm sure, like, yeah, Sonic Forces might not be great, but at least it's not this. Like, if that's what they grew up with, and they've spent their whole lives, like, their whole online lives being told, like, the things that you loved when you were a kid sucked, the things you loved when you were a kid sucked, over and over and over again, then it makes a degree of sense that they would be angrily lashing out and pushing back against this negativity.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah. And what it's come down to is, now, at this point, the fact that classic Sonic and modern Sonic are officially two different entities, two different things, two different versions of the character, like, that was at one time this really cool, like, sort of, like, love letter to the fandom. But at this point, it's more representative of just how fractured the community is, because like that's just yet another sticking point. That's just yet another thing. Like Sonic Mania can come out and blow everyone's mind and make people so happy. And then you've got these people who are like, but what about our Sonic? What about modern Sonic? What about the 3D game?
Yeah.
And who kind of, take the success of like Sonic Mania personally. So, and what I got to thinking about it, and what I got to thinking about was just like, for those of us who did live through this bad period and saw what was happening at the time and saw this massive drop off in quality for the franchise, these teenagers coming in and yelling about how Sonic 06 wasn't actually that bad, that can drive you crazy. I mean, come on, it's a soft reboot of a beloved franchise that goes all in on realistic environments, tries to tell more epic stories, redesigns the characters to look more contemporary and gives them voices, and just keeps piling on more and more new characters. And that's when I realized, oh no, we've become the NES kids who didn't like Donkey Kong Country. Like, all of a sudden, my brain made this connection between 1A and 1B and was like, wait a minute, there's actually a lot of parallels here.
There are, yeah, there are. And it's funny because, like, I was seeing all these parallels as you were saying them, but I was seeing them like different eras of Donkey Kong. And yeah, like, it's weird to put myself in the perspective that, cause I was like empathizing with like classic Sonic fans there, right? Like the short, stubby, poor postured Sonic, and then we've got the the limber Sonic who does DDP yoga, and
yes.
and I was like, oh, hell with him. And then now you're putting a twist on me here, where it's like, oh, Hyle, no. The Donkey Kong you like would be the equivalent to that latter Sonic. And I'd be like, what? But I mean, you're kind of right from a certain point of view. And, Donkey Kong Country, 1994. And it's weird to think in terms of Donkey Kong Country only came out 13 years after the original arcade Donkey Kong. 13 years. Mm-hmm. That's nothing at our age. That is a drop in the bucket. 13 years ago, that was close to the time Donkey Kong Barrel Blast came out, right? So, I mean, that is the gulf of time between then and DKC's release. But Donkey Kong Country was a radical reinvention of not just the characters, but what it meant to be a Donkey Kong game. And to the purist, to the people who would pump quarters in those machines trying to get the high score in Donkey Kong, or maybe stuck around for Donkey Kong Jr., and probably not many care about Donkey Kong 3 because nobody really cares about that except a couple weirdos who stan Stanley. But to those people, this huge game that is the talk of everyone, that stores are selling out of Black Friday 94, to bear the name Donkey Kong and to have nothing in common with where their passions lied when they were kids, when they were teenagers, that must have been the most frustrating experience.
I mean, it's a little bit like, I would never say it's a one-to-one thing, partly because a lot of the NES kids, like, yeah, while they might have preferred the arcade Donkey Kong and where's Donkey Kong Jr., like, a lot of them, they weren't really gonna die on that hill the way a lot of Sonic fans were, because their true passion lied with Mario, right?
Well, I mean, I think you definitely see, like, the people who are all about the arcade Donkey Kong, right? To them, that is Donkey Kong. Outside of those, and maybe first two games, maybe three, we'll throw in Donkey Kong 94, maybe the first Mario versus Donkey Kong game, depending on, how dedicated they are. you definitely have those people. To them, that is Donkey Kong, and anything else is Donkey Kong in name only, right? But that was also amusingly baked into Donkey Kong Country. That tension was almost predicted by Rare, and they made it an essential component of the universe by aging up the original Donkey Kong into Cranky Kong, who shit talks the very game he finds himself in, and how the franchise has evolved. And in a weird way, though, I realize, because I like my personal history, right? I played the original Donkey Kong, an abbreviated version of it, because I've got Donkey Kong Classics for the NES, which was a cartridge that contained the original Donkey Kong for the NES and Donkey Kong Jr. for the NES. But the original Donkey Kong for the NES omitted one stage, which was the Pie Factory. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't the complete arcade Donkey Kong.
Actually, Hyle, I grew up without the Pie Factory, and I don't think I think it's invalid. I don't think it deserves to be part of the Donkey Kong canon.
But I played that well before Donkey Kong Country, and I say well before because when you're a kid, 1 year is the equivalent to 5 adult years. So I probably played it like 2 years before Donkey Kong Country, right? Maybe 3. Mm-hmm. And that's when I got it. I got it on discount from KB Toys in the mall. Do you remember KB Toys? Anybody remember?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, yeah. How are those gray hairs forming on your head, Josh?
Oh, God. Man, you talked about renting things earlier. It seems like in almost every video, I'm like, oh yeah, I rented this game when it came out. And every year that passes since Blockbuster closed, I'm like, yes. Oh man, that just ages me more and more.
I'm really like going on a tangent here, so I'll try to rein it in. But it's funny because when I was a kid, I would make intentionally older references to seem more like distinguished and like out of time and knowledgeable. And now when I do it, I'm just like, oh, I'm so fucking old. Like it's no longer a mark of how like worldly I am. It's just I'm fucking old as shit, and I should be spat upon by the youth. They should kick me in the streets if we weren't social distancing. No, I got Donkey Kong Classics for the NES because as a kid I was just drawn to gorillas, simians of all sort, primates. I loved gorillas. I loved chimps, orangutans, all the monkeys. That was just, there was something about them to the point where I am partially convinced I was one in a past life, and I'm just like, oh, those are my people right there. So a game that starred a gorilla and Mario, who I was well acquainted with, because I didn't realize Donkey Kong came first. I thought this was just a weird Mario side game at the time, because couldn't look it up on Wikipedia, right? I had no encyclopedic knowledge except what I had been exposed to. So I got it, and I hated I played it, but I instinctively did not like the original Donkey Kong because you were fighting the gorilla. But Donkey Kong Jr., there was a game I could really sink my teeth into because
That's incredible that even then.
Yeah, no, like this predates Donkey Kong Country, and you can see why a game like Donkey Kong Country would just hit me in that sweet spot so much, because Donkey Kong Jr., I was playing as the gorilla, trying to rescue the gorilla's father from this evil human who I once loved. I once loved and respected Mario. I was all about, I watched the Super Mario Brothers Super Show every afternoon and was pissed off when it was the Zelda cartoon, and it was on Fridays. They switched out the Super Mario cartoons of the Super Show with the Zelda cartoon, and I was like, no, I want Mario. I don't want this fucking elf boy. This is disgusting. This is false advertising. But I was all about Mario. I think Donkey Kong Jr. is what turned me on Mario initially, because I was like, he's torturing this gorilla. I don't care what beef they had before. This is a wild animal, and he has caged it. And now his poor son, he's raising a son. I didn't even know about Wrinkly at the time. None of us did. We didn't know if he was raising him alone or what was going on. Anyway, my point, Joshua, is that I became a Donkey Kong fan via Donkey Kong Jr., and then Super Mario Kart came out, and I could play as Donkey Kong Jr. in Super Mario Kart. So when I rented Super Mario Kart, never owned it, but I rented it several times, and I would exclusively play as Donkey Kong Jr. I would not even think about touching Toad or Yoshi. Now, I could play as a gorilla in a Mario game, and I could drive around on a go-kart. Yes, please, more of this. So Donkey Kong Country came out.
Donkey Kong Country was just like the game that they made for you specifically. It almost
and it's not just that it like finally gave me a Donkey Kong game sans Mario, but it was a game that was just dialed into every instinct I had ever had. Everything I had ever wanted in a game, I got with Donkey Kong Country. So it was definitely like the moment where I found my series, and I stopped like having all of these one night stands at Blockbuster. You know, I was like, no, this is my lady right here, Donkey Kong Country.
You became a man and you put away Street Fighter 2.
Yeah, I put a ring on that series, but then so I was like, finally, Donkey Kong is getting the respect it deserves. And completely ignorant of the fact that Donkey Kong was already a huge deal 13 years ago. Such a huge deal that it made Nintendo. It made it. And to me, like, Nintendo was something that started with the NES, with Super Mario Brothers, right? So I didn't realize how offensive Donkey Kong Country would be to those initial Donkey Kong fans, those people 13 years my elder.
And for me, like, as somebody like just a couple of years younger than you, you know, those couple of years made a much bigger difference at the time. I didn't even have that context for it. Like, to me, Donkey Kong Country might as well have been as far as I knew, Donkey Kong Country was the first game that had ever starred Donkey Kong.
Yeah.
Like, this was the only way that I knew the series. And I think this is partly why my brain made the connection. Because I said something in the Sonic Adventure 2 video, like, for the people who started with Sonic Adventure 2 Battle on the GameCube, as far as they knew, this was all Sonic had ever been. This was the only way they knew him, and it was pretty radically different from a lot of the stuff that had come before, but they had no context for that. And I had no context with Donkey Kong Country. My first sort of inkling was like finding Donkey Kong 94 at a store, and I'm like, okay, it has this weird, somewhat different version of Donkey Kong and Mario. Well, this could be cool. Is this some kind of a crossover game? So I got it, and you know, it starts off with like the first 4 levels of the arcade Donkey Kong, and like I said, I had no context for what was even going on there. I didn't know why I was playing as Mario, for one thing.
Yeah.
Like, it just seemed so completely out of step with, like, what I had come to think of as a game with Donkey Kong in the title.
Yeah, and it's funny, and I don't even know how this ties into our main point, but throughout the entire early era of Donkey Kong Country, like from 94 to 2002, when Rare had the creative direction of the franchise, there were kind of 2 parallel Donkey Kong continuities or series, similar to kind of what Sonic Generations presented with Stubbs Sonic and Lanky Sonic. Because we had the Donkey Kong 94 Donkey Kong and Jr. still appearing in things like the Game & Watch Gallery games. We had Mario Tennis for the Virtual Boy that had Donkey Kong Jr. in it. And this was like 95, right? They would pop up in things like that alongside Donkey Kong Country and Land and Donkey Kong 64. And it was just like the most logical thing to me, because I was like, well, yeah, because these take place in the past. It's the earlier iterations of the character, not the modern current versions, the Donkey Kong of the future that Rare is giving us. And then once the buyout happened and Rare became a studio under Microsoft, then almost like immediately they consolidated it all under Rare's Donkey Kong. And that shift happened with Game & Watch Gallery 4 for the Game Boy Advance that came out late 2002. They didn't have time to change the sprites for Donkey Kong in the actual game, but on the title screen, they did update him to the Donkey Kong Country Donkey Kong, which is why DK Vine covers it, even though he only appears on the title screen. But yeah, that is the game that kind of put an end to the bifurcation of the Donkey Kong series, which led to some problems down the line. But
yeah, that's the thing. Like one of the major differences between comparing Sonic Adventure to Donkey Kong Country, as you know, as some form of a soft reboot for each franchise, is that, like you said earlier, Rare built the passage of time and the reason for this new character design into the lore and the fabric and even the meta nature of Donkey Kong Country. And when the buyout happened, what we almost immediately started seeing was like the differences, that like the passage of time and those nuances started to seem to be somewhat lost in some contexts.
Yeah. Yes.
And
yes.
I mean, we've seen that as late as like I remember Duck Hunt's trailer for Super Smash Bros. 4, where the arcade sprite of Donkey Kong is shown to transform directly into the 3D render of Rare's Donkey Kong.
Yeah, it's funny because Nintendo is obviously aware of the generational jump. Cranky is the original arcade Donkey Kong. They reference it whenever it's convenient to reference it, and they ignore it whenever it's convenient for them to ignore it. Because in Smash 4, they also make a point of referencing at one point that the current Donkey Kong is not the same as the arcade Donkey Kong, because they in one of the little challenges, they make a joke about time traveling back to 1981, but it's not the same characters. So they kind of have their cake and eat it too there. But that's kind of a nuance that is lost on the broad populace, because, you know, somebody's picking up a Donkey Kong game, they're not going to immediately know, okay, so in 1994, they aged up the characters, and the modern Donkey Kong is either Donkey Kong Jr. as adult or Donkey Kong Jr.'s son, but that means Donkey Kong Jr. either is a deadbeat father who abandoned him with his father, or something tragic happened to him. So it's like, no, that's not communicated.
And it's very much, I think, a sort of symptom of the Donkey Kong franchise in sort of the early to mid 2000s getting pulled much more back into the orbit of the Mario franchise, which, you know, quite infamously has a very loose approach to continuity.
Yeah, so, yeah, like, basically what happened, I mentioned earlier in the episode what happens when fans in one generation come of age and kind of start taking the reins a little bit more. And I don't know if this is necessarily what happened with Donkey Kong and the development of Donkey Kong games, more so than it was just Nintendo reasserting control after ceding it to Rare for the most part for a good 8 years or so. But you definitely saw it with critics and reviewers who were now getting jobs at outlets like Nintendo Power. And then they were kind of forcing their narrative onto the younger generation that was the 12-year-olds of that era, while as a young 20-something, late teen, early 20-something in college, finding myself stuck in the middle between these two generations who are now one generation who had animosity towards my beloved Donkey Kong Country, and now the younger generation was being poisoned against it. And I was aghast. I was like, what is happening? This is my favorite, like, fictional universe you're attacking. This is my childhood you're coming after. Are you saying my childhood has less validity than your own? And this was the first time I had ever experienced anything like this, not realizing that I had been a part of the very thing that I was railing against when I was 12.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I have really noticed and really tried to become more aware of is this sort of, I don't know if you can call it a backfire effect or a pendulum effect, but you can see it happening individually, and you can see it happening within, like, wider swaths of a community. Because the thing is, I don't think when Donkey Kong Country 1 first came out, I never saw anybody, like, admittedly, all I really had to go on back then was gaming magazines. But gaming magazines, at least at the time, seemed to be absolutely blown away by it. They seemed, they praised every aspect of it. They loved it. It wasn't until a few years down the line, about the time that Rare was sold to Microsoft, and that surely had something to do with it, but it was also, I think, the NES kids reaching adulthood and starting to gain a great deal of reverence and appreciation and nostalgia for the things that they had grown up with.
Yes.
And for most of them, it just so happened that Donkey Kong Country fell outside of that purview.
Most of the Super Nintendo generation, like, was out of the zeitgeist for them. And yeah, you might get, like, some things grandfather did, like maybe Super Mario World will allow that. Maybe Super Mario Kart. I remember there was a window of time where Mario Kart 64 was derided, and I was like, Super Mario Kart is the quintessential Mario Kart experience. Yeah. And so
I remember being a kid and going and reading a review of Star Fox 64 on a fan site that just was so freaking angry at it, was so, like, offended by the fact that, in their opinion, it didn't even remotely live up to the perfection of the original Star Fox on Super Nintendo. And, like, I had played Star Fox on Super Nintendo, albeit I played it after Star Fox 64, and, like, I was like, it blew my mind that anybody could see it that way.
Right, and I mean, like, taking a step back, I don't care, like, how rose-tinted your glasses are for what you grew up with or what hit that sweet spot of your youth. Star Fox 64 is a vastly superior game to Star Fox original flavor. It's basically the original game, but perfected. Like, it's just... But yeah, like, it's...
And, like, I agree from my own perspective, but, like, I have a great deal of nostalgia for Star Fox 64. Like, I'm sure that some people might say that they don't like the original Donkey Kong Country trilogy, but Returns and Tropical Freeze, that they can get into, that's that formula perfected.
And that's like, I could see somebody who grew up with Returns. It's, I've go on about this all the time, but how sobering it is to realize, like, the kids who were, again, 12 years old, and it can be a little bit younger, can be a little bit older. I'm just using that as a generalization, when you're not quite a teenager yet, but you're, like, at your peak of childhood before the hormones start kicking in. Like, the kids who were 12 when Donkey Kong Country Returns came out, they're turning 20 this year. So, like, to that generation of young adults...
Well, hang on, Hyle. Wouldn't they be... The kids who were 12 when Donkey Kong Country Returns came out would be turning 22!
I was thinking it was 2018
I don't know about you.
Still. Okay. No. Okay, so yeah, they're entering the workforce. Wait,
yeah.
What workforce? Yeah,
well.
forget about that. No, they're filing for unemployment. Whatever we do now to make money. But yeah, they're 22. So to all these, like, young adults who are graduating college or having their senior year shortened, like Donkey Kong to them is Donkey Kong Country Returns or Tropical Freeze. Like it's that retro style, retro studios, not retro in that sense, retro studio style of Donkey Kong Country, and the original Super Nintendo trilogy is this archaic thing from way back yonder, covered in cobwebs. And that's sobering for me to realize, so much so that I downplayed the actual age they would be in my mind to protect myself from the harsh realities of aging. But I'm okay with that, and I've accepted that, and I kind of accepted it way back when Donkey Kong Country Returns first came out, because I think it's important for the survival, and maybe this is my grand thesis, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here, but I think it's important for the survival of what you love, for it to evolve and adapt to the taste of that generation. Otherwise, it's going to be long forgotten, like those 1910 cartoon strips that are never getting revived again. So, I think things have to adapt over time, as painful as it is. I remember back in 2004, I was working like at these, dead end retail jobs in the mall, to make ends meet. Still in college at the time, but I remember talking with this guy, my direct supervisor, who was like 8 years older than me. We're talking about Nintendo. He was a big Nintendo fan, obviously of an older generation. And he was super excited because this new game came out for the Game Boy Advance called Mario vs. Donkey Kong. And
I see where this is going.
He was like, oh, I can't wait to get home because I've been playing Mario vs. Donkey Kong and it's so good. I was like, oh, is it? Like, because I was still, I was running DK Vine at that point. That was like at a point where we were kind of rebranding it to fit the buyout era, adding all the neon and
floating heads.
Yeah. I didn't divulge that aspect of my life because I could kind of see where this is going. But I was like, oh, really? Yeah, I haven't. I have it, but I haven't played it yet. I'm a little bit weary. And he was like, oh, why? And I was like, well, I loved Rare's Donkey Kong, and this to me seems like it's kind of a betrayal of that, and maybe I shouldn't have used the word betrayal, but he looked at me with like dead eyes. I'll never forget these dead eyes, Josh. And he was just like, well, this is the real Donkey Kong. Like Donkey Kong Country, Donkey Kong Country, they weren't good games. They didn't have good graphics. They looked good at the time. They haven't aged well. This was 2004, mind you. And he was like, they were all like flash and no substance. And I'm glad they got rid of Rare because they just cannot make good games. The classic Nintendo ultra loyalist mantra of the early aughts where, oh, Rare never made good games. Like, we're not gonna, thank God we're rid of them. Phew, that's a relief.
And that was the day that Hyle was fired.
No, I tried to be very polite because I'm an introvert, right? Especially back then, I hadn't really blossomed into the specimen that is before you today. I was very like low on self-esteem and self-assurance, so I was basically going to let him walk all over me and my points. I wasn't doing a podcast where I had to express myself every week, but I was like, oh, well, I'm sorry you feel that way, but those are my favorite games of all time, and I don't think we discussed Nintendo much after that. I really don't. But yeah, like that was the first time. Like, I'd been confronted with hostility towards Donkey Kong Country. Not towards Rare, because I remember I brought this up before. I went to GameStop in 2002 to reserve Star Fox Adventures, and the guy working there tried to talk me out of the reservation.
Oh my god.
Yeah.
Jeez.
Yeah, and this was like after it had already been known that Rare was being sold to Microsoft, and he was like, this game's not going to be good. Nintendo got rid of Rare for a reason. This isn't even a real Star Fox game. Why would you want to do this to yourself?
That's this fascinating thing where it's like these game employees, these people working at game stores at the time were trying to talk customers out of giving them money for some reason.
Right, like
that. My mom has a story about that, and people think people occasionally comment on my video where I talk about it, thinking I'm making it up. Where for Christmas in '97, I wanted a Sega Saturn, and the Saturn was pretty much dead by then. It wasn't going to last much longer past that. But she has a story where she called a game store to make a reservation for it, and they said, "Oh, he doesn't want a Saturn, he wants a PlayStation."
Oh, no.
And she had to be like, "No, he wants a Saturn."
I'm glad I never had that awkward moment when I got a Virtual Boy. Yeah, it's weird, especially because, I've worked retail. Like, I know, like, they live and die on all of, the aggressive pushes by corporate to get reservations, to get, membership cards, to do this and that. And it's so fucking bizarre to me that this guy tried to talk me out of getting a reservation. And he would have been in his probably mid-30s, I would say. So this was 2002, so you do the math and figure out like what he was a fan of.
Exactly.
And, yeah. And it doesn't surprise me how antagonistic and angry and angsty DK Vine was in this period in the aughts, in the so-called buyout era, because it felt like we were being assaulted on all sides. And it's hyperbole. It's ridiculously over the top. None of this really matters, but it did feel like we were on the defensive from everybody.
And that feeling, that right there, being on the defensive, is a big part of what I think sort of the problem and the danger and the toxicity in all of this is. Before I make that point, though, I want to just call back to earlier in the episode. When you said where you got your Virtual Boy, it reminded me, I did in fact get mine from KB Toys.
Oh, nice. Yeah. I didn't like KB Toys as much as Toys R Us, but
no,
in a pinch they would do.
Like, I, for some reason, distinctly remember this. I was like, would have been about 9 years old, but like, by then I knew, I didn't know the value of $1, but I knew enough to know this was a hell of a deal, because the systems were $30 and the games were $10. And this was in like 1997, so, they'd probably been sitting there for a long time. But man, I wish I could just go back there and like buy that whole stack of games, because oh my god. You probably could have gotten a complete set of Virtual Boy games for like next to nothing.
It bothers me. I think I'm missing like 3 or 4 Virtual Boy games out of the entire library, at least that was released in the West. But whatever. I'm amazed I got that much. I got most of them from Blockbuster when they were like liquidating their supply, their rental supply. So it's just like, I'll pick this up, pick that up. Great. But yeah, the toxicity and the putting the prior generation on the defensive, I feel like is something that now that I'm in that older mid-30s range where I am the standard bearer of the taste, I don't want to repeat my mistakes or the mistakes of the previous generation. And that's why like a game like Donkey Kong Country Returns and Tropical Freeze, to me, I really enjoyed them because after the drought of no Donkey Kong Country games and the weird tug of war we got with Donkey Kong, where what is Donkey Kong? Is it the arcade style? Is it like are we gonna like innovate with bongos? Are we going to like use the rare characters, but in weird like side games that are divisive? Are we just going to port Donkey Kong Country to different platforms? The original trilogy until the end of time. After that tug of war, having a stable direction that more or less kinetically lined up with what we wanted, if not necessarily like the characters we wanted back and what have you. But to have that, it was like, okay, you know what? I'm going to stop complaining. This is pretty solid. You know, this is better than we had. And, you know, I still have issues with Returns. I still have issues with Tropical Freeze. I have issues with some of the choices Retro both made consciously and had to make by edict. But I'm never going to disparage. I am never going to tell anybody who says those are their favorite Donkey Kong games that they're wrong, because they are as much Donkey Kong fans as I am. And I'm just glad to have them in the fandom. And I don't know if that is just the perspective of what Donkey Kong Country fans went through in the aughts, in the noughties, if you want to bring the Beavers into it. I don't know if it's unique or if it's just I am enough of a student of pop culture that I can see the cycle repeat itself time and again, and I want to break it. I don't know what it is, but I definitely don't want to treat them the way we were treated.
And that's the thing. Like, this goes back to the sort of sociological tug of war, is that, like I said a little while ago, I don't think most NES kids had a lot, like, I think a lot of them really liked Donkey Kong Country when it first came out, and I think, like, I didn't, like I said earlier, I didn't see a whole lot of, like, vitriol being directed at it until it started being held up in contrast to their childhood and to the Donkey Kong that they grew up with. But here's the thing, and this is something that I'm trying to be more aware of in myself and more aware of in and just I find it interesting to look at this stuff in fandoms, because part of the reason that DK Vine, or Donkey Kong Universe at that time, that you felt like you had to be on the defensive was because you felt like you were being assaulted from all sides, was because you felt like the degree of vitriol that was being slung at your childhood favorites, the toxicity that was being put out there about them. Oh, DKC was never good. DKC was overrated. DKC was all style and no substance. This is the real Donkey Kong. This is what a Donkey Kong game should really be. Like, that kind of ended up having a backfire effect on you, where, you know, it's not, you played the arcade games first. You didn't hate Mario. You didn't hate Shigeru Miyamoto. You didn't hate Nintendo. But in contrast, like, in the course of defending what you liked back then, what you liked at that time, you dug your heels in and you attacked these things that were not what you liked. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah. And it was pure spite. It was, okay, this is the way it's gonna be. Fine. This is war. And trust me, I hate the way I acted back then. And it's something that I think, like, this current era of DK Vine is just a constant atonal for. I put so much negativity out there, and I could have been the bigger person then, but it felt like if I give an inch, then they're gonna win. Then my vision of Donkey Kong will fade away. And I've got to be nasty. I've got to be like eye for an eye, just go for the jugular. And the thing is, like, that never works. That never works when you get what you want. We didn't get K. Rool in Super Smash Brothers through a negative campaign. We were upset when he wasn't in Smash 4. Obviously, there was a lot of probably hurtful things said, but, like, I feel like at the end of the day, what got him in was the positivity and goodwill that we presented through the ballot. Right? So, like, I feel like celebrating what you love is a lot more important than deriding what you hate.
And because the Sonic franchise has always had all these different continuities, all these tonally clashing styles, and because the games themselves, at least over the course of the past 20 years, have never really gone more than a couple of entries without trying to reinvent themselves on some level. Like, the broken base that exists between, like, NES era Donkey Kong fans, NES and arcade era Donkey Kong fans, and Donkey Kong Country fans, like, that exists in the Sonic community in much more numerous and heavily divided fractures, or so it seems. Or at least it can feel that way.
Mm-hmm.
In reality, I've come to sort of realize that I don't think, like, the Sonic fandom has such a horrible reputation in many circles, and often deservedly so. But from talking to fans as individuals and kind of trying to figure out what they want, what I've sort of come to appreciate both in them and in myself lately, because honestly, a couple of months ago, this whole debate was just burning me the fuck out, and it was making me feel bad, and I was losing sleep over it. And like, I didn't feel like it was something that I was really approaching in, like, a way that was good for me, or in a way that was good for the fandom. And what I've sort of had to try to do is come to see, like, the way that you approach the Donkey Kong fandom, and the way that, like, because of the fact that you run DK Vine, because of the fact that I make a show on the internet called the Geek Critique, like, you and I are kind of ambassadors for the fandoms anyway, of the things that we like. And I think that we have a responsibility to, like, not give in to toxicity, to do positive things for the fandom and like, for these properties and for these things that we love. And like I said, just from talking to other Sonic fans, I think while everyone has their preferences, and those preferences for what they would like Sonic to be sort of run across a very wide spectrum, probably a spectrum that one franchise or one game is never going to be able to satisfy, I think what most of us really want is a focused, like, a Sonic game that is focused and knows what kind of game it wants to be, and is able to execute on that with aplomb. Like, everybody has their preferences. Everybody has their preferences as to what kind of game Sonic should be, what the gameplay should be like, what the tone should be like, what the story should be like, even what the character designs should be like, what eye color the characters should have. But too often, I think, some of the most extreme, toxic, sort of purist people who have those preferences, and, like, there are people who will say, you know, this is all Sonic should be. This is the correct way that Sonic should be. This is the one true Sonic. And I think the degree of their passion causes this pendulum effect in different sects of the fandom, where in pushing back against that, people dig their heels in, and they make their preferences, whether those preferences align with this person's or not, they make their preferences into too much of, like, defining elements that must be there, when really, I think for most fans, these are just preferences.
We see that too in the Donkey Kong series on a smaller scale. Like, we talk about, like, these big generational gulfs, like arcade Donkey Kong Country, the buyout era, Jungle Beat, that whole scene, Returns. But you look at, like, the Rare era, there was 5 years between Donkey Kong Country and Donkey Kong 64. And those games are very tonally different too. Like, you could make the argument that had Donkey Kong 64 not been made by Rare, had it been the exact same game but had a different studio label on it, we would have hated it just as much. Like, and
that's a possibility, yeah.
You've got people who Donkey Kong 64 was their Donkey Kong game, and you see that a lot online now, where, like,
and you know, that's really interesting, because if I'm saying that, like, Donkey Kong Country was a similar reboot of Donkey Kong in the same way that Sonic Adventure 1 was of Sonic, interestingly enough, you could also make the argument that Donkey Kong 64 was also a reboot of Donkey Kong in the same vein as Sonic Adventure 1.
Well, when you were discussing Sonic 06 and you were talking about how everything reached this ridiculous, crescendo with all these characters and
Mm-hmm.
just the tone being completely off the rails, the whole time I was thinking, this sounds like Donkey Kong 64. This sounds
Yeah.
like, and ironically, your Sonic 06 video made me appreciate Donkey Kong 64 all the more because I realized, it might be a quote unquote bad game in comparison to the other games in our series or the other games made by Rare, but it's not necessarily a bad game when you compare it to bad games. So there are degrees of what a bad game is, and at the very least, Donkey Kong 64 is playable. It's
Mm-hmm.
not inherently broken. So
I would say Donkey Kong 64 more sullied the reputation of the collectathon genre,
yeah.
unfortunately, than it sullied the reputation of the Donkey Kong franchise.
And there are still people who swear by Donkey Kong 64 because that is what they
Mm-hmm.
grew up with. That was the game they played when they were that right age where
Yeah, because that's a long time. There are people, if you never owned a Super Nintendo, but you did grow up with an N64, Donkey Kong 64 was the only game in the franchise you could possibly play on that thing.
Yeah, yeah. So, I hardly ever think of Donkey Kong 64 in those terms because that was still like Donkey Kong 64 is the game I've been waiting for since I played Donkey Kong Country, and I knew that Nintendo was making this new console and that Rare was playing a big part in the future plans of it. And so I was like, yeah, we're gonna get Donkey Kong for this new console and it's gonna be amazing. If they could do this on a Super Nintendo, what are they gonna do on this thing? So like Donkey Kong 64 was like the culmination of my fandom at that point. I launched, DK Vine. I set out to create a website, that year because Donkey Kong 64 had been announced. And I was like, I've got to do this. I've got to finally like commit, to my love of this series. And this is the time to do it. And, so I never think of Donkey Kong 64 divorced from that, but for anybody younger than me, yeah, absolutely, it would have been.
Yeah, imagine, I guess, if all you knew of Donkey Kong was DK64 and the way that the characters were portrayed, the story was portrayed, the style of gameplay, then going back to this more somber, more melancholy, more realistic, and, much more aged just by nature of being a 2D game, Donkey Kong Country series would probably seem kind of jarring.
Yeah, yeah. Like, what is with all this moody music in these mines? Like, where's the rap? Like, what is happening? Like, why doesn't Donkey Kong make a splat noise when he falls? Like, what?
Well, I think having this metaphor and being able to see these sort of fandom parallels really gives me a much greater appreciation for where these new school Sonic fans are coming from, because the thing is, this cycle has happened, but they're repeating the same cycle that I've already seen the fandom go through once.
Yeah,
Because over the course of a couple years, the 3D Sonic games and the modern Sonic design are just built up as this. This is everything wrong with Sonic. This is everything that's killing Sonic. Sega has to take it back. Sega has to go back to the roots and give us the Sonic of our childhood. And then, saying oh, the adventure games, which, we all seem to love which most of us seem to love at the time, now we hate them. Now they were never actually good. Now, actually, this was always all wrong for Sonic. Sonic's never worked in 3D. The way that, a fandom that's repeatedly presented with sort of a version of a character that they don't like in the quality of the games go downhill over time, and to be clear, for me personally, I thought it was overstated at the time. I thought it was ridiculous to, there were people who said, oh, Sonic only works in 2D. Oh, only this black-eyed, pudgy Sonic, that's the real Sonic. That's the only good one. At the time, I thought that was overstated. I could clearly see the reputation and the quality of the game slipping over time, but I tried not to let it reflect poorly on the earlier games, which I actually did like. And what we're seeing now is just that exact thing, where it's like there's a younger sect of Sonic fans, and again, I don't want to generalize because I have talked to people who became fans in the last 10 years and love things they didn't grow up with. They love things that's why I say there's a sect. I don't say that every single Sonic fan who was in their early 20s believes this, because that's not even remotely true. But I see a part of the fandom going through that same cycle again, where, they're saying, oh man, Sonic the past 10 years has sucked. There's no redeeming qualities to this. The adventure era, that's when it was really good. That's when they really had it figured out. Sonic 06 wasn't actually that bad. And because with Donkey Kong in the mid-2000s, I was right there with you. I was reading DK Vine. I was pushing back on this anti-Rare, anti-DKC sentiment that seemed to be growing from mainstream gaming sites. And, hearing this story, hearing what you said about that guy who tried to tell you, oh, but this is the real Donkey Kong. It gives me a much greater perspective and a much greater appreciation for where these people are coming from and what that must feel like.
Yeah.
Because, like I said, Donkey Kong Country was the only way that I had ever known the character. It was the only version of the character that it was the most, and even once I got older and learned about it online, Donkey Kong Country was the legit article. That was the genuine version of what Donkey Kong and his games and his world were supposed to be. And in the same way, the Sonic Adventure games in 06 and even Secret Rings and Black Knight and these games that were not, some of which were not well thought of, nonetheless defined what Sonic was for the generation who grew up playing them. So, when Nintendo brought Donkey Kong, quote-unquote, back to his roots, which was what seemed to us to be those old, out-of-touch, curmudgeonly journalists in their late 20s wanted, when they brought him back to his roots and made him a villain and had him go against had him antagonize Mario again, which was completely out of step with everything we knew the character to be, that pissed us off.
Yeah.
And again, just generalizing, but when it seemed like everyone in the entire world insisted that Sonic games aren't supposed to be about story, they're supposed to be little happy fun time hop and bop platformers with a cutesy pudgy little Sonic running through loop-de-loops, and then Sega listened and did that and gave us that, and not only that, but everyone loved it and it was celebrated as the best Sonic game in 20 years, I can see why, depending on your perspective and depending on how you look at things, that might have pissed some Sonic fans off in the same way and for a lot of the same reasons.
I think that the message we need to convey to younger generations people who might be in their early 20s now and super invested in what was the hot version of the franchise when they were a child, a preteen, and are now faced with this. Faced with this revolt, with this backlash towards everything they thought was the center of the universe. Just hang in there, because you'll get your day again. It will come back around. You just have to wait it out. Everyone goes through this. We're now at a point where Donkey Kong Country, the backlash towards it has pretty much worked itself out. Every now and then you'll still find someone who has some snark to give towards it. But you look, okay, you want a good example of how far we've come in just the last 6 years. Look at the reception Tropical Freeze got in 2014 versus the Switch release of Tropical Freeze in 2018. 4 years, but they made all of the difference. And now people, you still get of course, hardcore sex, Nintendo communities who were still dominated by, the opinions of those, curmudgeons from the NES era, or maybe, kids from the GameCube era who became adults, who were taught that Donkey Kong Country was overrated and not a major franchise and blah, 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 blah. But by and large, the Donkey Kong Country kids are now in the media. And the people who played Returns are now going to be entering the media. And you really see that shift in popular opinion now. It's like, oh no, Donkey Kong Country, those were great games. Not overrated at all. They were underrated, actually, for many years. And let me tell you why. And it's gratifying to see, and I wish I just would have had the perspective to hang in there, because I should have seen the way it works. Like, no, those people in the media, writing for Nintendo Power or Game Informer or whatever the fuck, in the aughts, in the early to mid aughts, they're not going to hold popular opinion exclusively forever. So,
right.
Just continue to gently advocate for what you love, celebrate what you think is worth celebrating, celebrate it with like-minded weirdos, but never disparage what you may not like, because eventually you're going to come to the realization that we're all kind of part of the same fandom, and we may have differing viewpoints on what makes that series work best. We might be drawn to different aspects of it.
We may like the series in completely different ways, but I think another thing I would say, and I would say this to like anybody involved in any kind of a fandom or any kind of a community, regardless of age, anybody can be susceptible to this stuff, is that I guess try to keep like a perspective on how much whatever you're arguing in favor of and whatever you're arguing against really, like, I don't want to say matters, because that seems like it undersells it, but try to keep a balanced, nuanced perspective, and try to make sure that you're doing your best and making a good faith effort to, even if you don't understand if you don't personally appreciate some aspect of the series or of whatever's being talked about, use that as an opportunity to get curious and try to figure out, okay, well, what do other fans appreciate about this?
Yeah.
Because me and you have talked about this sort of thing before. A fandom and a community can be a magnifier, but it can be a magnifier for positive traits and negative traits. I mean, I've talked to you before about how, like, I had grown up playing and loving and obsessing over the Donkey Kong Country games, and when I discovered DK Vine in the year 2000, the passion of your fandom was what caused me to really reflect back on that and get out the Super Nintendo and hook it up again and discover so much, like, as much as I had loved the series when I was like 8 years old, I discovered so much more enjoyment and appreciation for it replaying it when I was like 12 years old, and like the passion and the fandom of other people was kind of the catalyst for that. But by the same token, like the vitriol that you felt for, say, Mario versus Donkey Kong fed my vitriol.
Yeah.
And like, by the same token, the vitriol that many game journalists at the time had for Donkey Kong Country caused me to dig my heels in more for it and become more dedicated than I really should have been to the idea that this is the only way that Donkey Kong can ever be acceptable, is if Rare's handling it. And I can say that.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, there's the idiom, hurt people hurt people. And I feel like that's what we did. Or like, just because we were hurt by the reaction, by the backlash, the popular backlash towards what had been the hotness for several years in pop culture, because we were hurt by that, we lashed out and we spread that negativity, and it just kept cycling downward. And I sometimes like it's only with the wisdom of age that you realize how wrong you were. Like that's part of life, like you're not going to have everything figured out when you're 20. You think you do, but like if we had everything figured out when we were that young, there'd be no point in continuing. We would just ascend to whatever higher plane of existence there is and call it a life. Like I believe if there is any purpose to this beyond being matter that just consumes and reproduces, it is constantly bettering yourself and becoming a better ideal than you once were. And so there's no shame in being wrong and being a piece of shit at one point in your life, so long as you recognize that and say, okay, let me do that better.
Yeah, I say anybody is susceptible to this because, like I said, like early this year, like this was getting to me to the point, and like I get it. I get why. Like when people whose opinions like I really shouldn't care about, I really shouldn't take it this personally. Yes. When people who don't remember the war that classic fans waged against the adventure games, when I see them making some of those same mistakes and going through that same cycle and dunking on either my childhood favorites or the games of the last 10 years that I see as like really like the games that kind of started to turn things around for Sonic, like that, like the degree, like I think passion for a property without perspective and some degree of maturity and some degree of nuance can very easily become toxic.
Yeah, and well, the thing I like to pose to people when I feel like it is becoming toxic for them is this hobby, is this passion of yours actually bringing you enjoyment? Or is it bringing you such a world of hurt that you're no longer getting that joy from it? And then what's the point? What is the point?
I'm just like, what I have though is the perspective to sort of recognize that sort of thing, because when I noticed that this wasn't bringing me any enjoyment, I had the ability to disengage from it. I had the ability to mute some words on social media and take a step back from it. And then I went back and I played some of my favorite and my least favorite Sonic games, and I tried to approach even the ones that I didn't like with this perspective of like, okay, but what could someone like about them? What does work about these, or what could work about them if they were a little more refined? And I had to remind myself, okay, I have never hated the modern Sonic design. I've always had a preference for the old one, but I've always been really happy with the modern one too. But that's just that pendulum effect where like you have to be able to stay aware of this and be aware of it. I think it ties into like the tribalism of that's sort of a part of human nature. And if you're not aware of it, then you're going to be eaten by it.
Yeah.
And I had to come back with a healthier perspective, and this perspective that we're going to understand people, we're going to talk to people, we're going to celebrate the things we like. And to be clear, I am not saying for a second that if you hate Mario vs. Donkey Kong and you think that's wrong, that you shouldn't argue against it and argue your point. But there's a difference between doing that and saying people you never would have done this, of course, but like calling the people who would have been like, oh, Mario versus Donkey Kong, that's the real Donkey Kong, just being like, well, you're just a fake fan and you don't know what you're talking about. Like, you can attack the aspects of a series you don't like without attacking the fans of that thing.
And the thing is, like, I still don't really care for Mario versus Donkey Kong, but I can respect the people who love it. Because to them, like, that is Donkey Kong. And, who am I to be the guardian, the sole tastemaker of what Donkey Kong is? I'm nobody. Like, it's all up to the individual. And I think it was a sobering lesson for me when I went back and I played Donkey Kong Jungle Beat after Donkey Kong Country Returns came out. And I discovered, oh, this is a really fun game. Damn it.
Yeah, I remember
Damn it. And I think that was my first taste of this added perspective of, just because this isn't my favorite portrayal of Donkey Kong, and just because it doesn't have any of the characters I love from this series in it, and just because it is so tonally weird and not my ideal of what Donkey Kong is, doesn't mean I can't say I've had a really good time playing it. And I celebrate aspects of Jungle Beat now. Like it's not something I shy away from, even if that's never what I'm going to reach for when I want the experience of my favorite series. It doesn't mean I can't celebrate it all the same.
Yeah, and like I had the exact same experience with Jungle Beat. Despite having DK bongos, because Donkey Kongo was just way too stupid of an idea for me to be able to pass up in the first place, I'd never played Jungle Beat before the Wii version with the new play control came out. And part of the reason that I'd never even rented it, and it was this sobering moment of playing it for the first time in like 2009, I think, but yeah, this would have been before DKC Returns was announced, that I was like, man, this really fun game has been here for 4 years, and I've basically never played it because DK Vine told me that it wasn't going to be the real Donkey Kong.
Whoops.
Yeah, I'm not, dude, I totally get it.
Right. Well, that's, again, that's why I definitely am trying to encourage positivity, and you can dislike what you dislike. I'm not saying everybody needs to be mindless consumers who just blindly accept whatever product they're putting out and saying, yes, this is perfect, this is the greatest thing of all time, aka how we received Donkey Kong 64 on DK Vine back when it came out. Like, there is a middle ground to take. There is, like, you can not like something, but you don't have to let it ruin you, and more importantly, you don't have to ruin it for others.
Yeah. And that just your preferences are preferences. Keep a perspective and stay aware of what your preferences are and what your necessities are, because ultimately nothing about the elements of a video game franchise is really a necessity to you.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's weird for me to think about, because
like, I love video games. My whole life is video games. I met my I met my fiance because of video games. My career is video games.
Yeah.
But video games aren't worth losing sleep over.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's a bit weird for us because our careers are both video games and video game commentary. But you're right. Like, if Donkey Kong was still stressing me out as much now as it did 15 years ago, then I would have a problem. I would probably be a haggard mess right now if this is what I was doing with my life. Thankfully it's not, and thankfully I've like found some inner peace with it. And even the things I don't like, I can still like find an amusement for. Like, there are like things in the Donkey Kong series I don't necessarily like, but I can still embrace the bad with the good and kind of laugh about it. And because it's all part of this weird tapestry, right? Like this mosaic of greatness and garbage. And that's going to be any long-running series. That's going to be any fandom that's been around for longer than a few years. You're going to have some shit in there, and you've got to just kind of embrace it as part of your shared language, and also recognize that your shit is other people's sustenance. Think of the dung beetle, right?
Oh my god. Yeah, I get what you're saying.
Yeah, we have some calls to take, Josh, and
Sure.
and then we'll wrap this up, because I feel like we're just a couple beats away from singing Kumbaya. So let's take the first call.
Hey, Hyle and Josh. My name's Shane. I'm a longtime listener, four-time co-host, and first-time caller. You probably touched on this already, but I find it interesting that such a strong parallel can be made between Donkey Kong 64 and Sonic Adventure 2. Both of these games were heavily criticized by their respective fandoms upon release, but sometime roughly 5 to 10 years later, particularly in spaces not specifically geared towards Donkey Kong or Sonic fans, these games started being hailed as the best each series had to offer. It would be crazy to suggest that hate-filled Donkey Kong 64 internet critics or hate-filled Sonic Adventure 2 internet critics even existed. I think a lot of us in both fandoms tend to forget how many fans came to these series through these games, particularly in Sonic's case, where the GameCube version of Sonic Adventure 2 was the first Sonic game many Nintendo kids owned or even played. There's a whole generation of fans who barely know who Swanky Kong is, but would be overjoyed if, say, Lanky Kong came back. Or in Sonic's case, tons of people who think music in a Sonic game should be more rock than pop. God, I personally don't think we should live in a world where anyone is unaware of Swanky Kong, but here we are. As both of these series have made attempts to return to their roots through games like the Donkey Kong Country Returns series, or Sonic Mania, what elements from Donkey Kong 64 or the 3D Sonic games do you guys think could be retrofitted into a third Returns-style game, or a Sonic Mania 2? In Sonic's case, I'd probably like to see Blaze the Cat appear as a playable character. She's probably my favorite modern Sonic character, and one of the easiest to include in the classic timeline without straight-up remaking the storyline of an already existing modern Sonic game. There were also no female characters in Sonic Mania, which was a bit silly. In Donkey Kong's case, I think it would be fun to set a world on the mechanical Crocodile Isle, and a return of Lanky Kong, like I mentioned earlier, is sure to be a crowd pleaser, especially if they can find a way to utilize him well on a 2D plane. I also think the DK Isle theme would make great world map music. It's actually a bit sad none of Kirkhope's music has been reimagined outside of his own work on the Rabbids game.
Thank you for the call, Shane. So, Josh.
Yes.
Yes,
all right. Well,
I'll let you start.
Okay, it's interesting. A couple things that I thought were interesting in there. One was just how kind of strange it is at this point that when it comes to 3D Sonic games, there are at least 4 different styles you can point to that they've tried out over the years of like how to do a 3D Sonic game. Whereas with Donkey Kong DK64, that's it. That's the 3D Donkey Kong game it has been for 21 years.
I have a question, Josh, because when you say
Yes.
3D Sonic games, I'm going to show my age here.
Okay.
When you say 3D Sonic game, what immediately comes to mind for me is Sonic 3D Blast. Are you including Sonic 3D Blast?
No, I mean polygonal 3D Sonic games. Although,
Okay.
yes, there was also the Sonic game with the term 3D in the title. But okay, 5 different styles of 3D Sonic games.
It just looked like Kirby's Dream Course to me, but...
It was actually a platformer and not like a golf, a sort of golf game. Although Sonic also did have a game that was almost literally Kirby's Dream Course for the Game Gear called Sonic Labyrinth. Like, that was, like, the exact same gameplay style.
And, you say this with almost disdain, but I'm just over here thinking, man, how fortunate is it that your series has all of these weird games. I would love a Donkey Kong game styled after Kirby's Dream Course.
Well, the tough thing there is that how do you make the characters roll into balls?
With Donkey Kong, they roll into balls all the time. Donkey Kong, that's like his primary mode of walking.
Yeah, he does the barrel roll. Okay, yeah, it could work. Although, I guess the Donkey Kong game that's most like Kirby's Dream Course would have to be Barrel Maze.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, let's just get a new Barrel Maze. Oh, I can't wait for the Spotlight episode on Barrel Maze.
I gotta call dibs on that one.
Fine, that's great. I could talk 5 hours about Barrel Maze minimum.
We can have the inexplicable ska music playing under the entire thing.
The same song every single.
Okay, more to
Okay.
the question, which
All right.
was what elements from the 3D entries in the series would we like to see in a hypothetical either new Return style game or new Mania style game.
Sure.
Well, the other thing that jumped out to me there was, it's funny how it seems like everybody likes Blaze the Cat. Like, everybody in the Sonic fandom has an appreciation for Blaze the Cat. Even the classic, the sort of classic exclusive fans who largely are like, oh, all these damn new characters, but you know what? Blaze the Cat's alright.
Can you answer this for me? Is he a stoner? Is that why he's Blaze the Cat, or?
Oh, it's actually a woman.
Oh,
Blaze is a female character.
Excuse me, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to misgender Blaze the Cat. Is she a stoner?
No, but when she spin dashes, she twirls around in fire. So
she just self-emulates. Okay, great.
Yes. You know, and weirdly, like, here's sort of what my initial answer was going to be. It's a little bit different because Donkey Kong Country Returns, like, that style of game is like, it's not just a retro throwback despite who makes it. It is a modernized take on the Donkey Kong Country formula that both reimagines and reinvents aspects of Rare's design and incorporates lots of all-new elements. I mean, Donkey Kong Country Returns already has some elements from DK64 in there, like Diddy's peanut pop guns and Jetpack.
Although that's pretty much Smash.
That's more Smash
influence.
than DK64. That's true. At this point. Contrastly, the appeal of Sonic Mania specifically was that it was an absolute throwback to 1996. That incorporate like for good and for bad, from the focus on it, like the fact that it had a time limit to a live system, to the graphical style of the game. Everything about it was emulating what a 2D Sonic game might have been on the Sega Saturn. And I think because of that, having something, I mean, look, I love Blaze the Cat like everybody else. But in Sonic Mania specifically, or in a game that's like where that is all it's trying to be, like, I think having a character, like, to me as a classic fan, as somebody who started in that era, Shadow the Hedgehog would feel very out of place there.
Right.
However, that's not to say that I wouldn't, that I'd ever be against, like, a game that's not necessarily like a 2D Sonic game that's not narrowly trying to emulate exclusively the style of the classics, but is rather incorporating some of its best elements, incorporating some also, like, Blaze the Cat, Shadow the Hedgehog, even if it had a Biggs fishing minigame, and there have been Sonic fan games and ROM hacks that do things like put Big the Cat in there, that would be awesome, and that I would welcome that.
Well, for me,
Sure.
I agree with Shane, because my first thought was get Lanky in there, because I feel like Lanky, not only, like, is Lanky the most unique of the Donkey Kong 64 newbie Kongs, in that he's not necessarily just replacing Dixie or Kitty like Tiny and Chunky arguably do, but I think he would fit tonally with the retro style of Donkey Kong Country, because the retro style of Donkey Kong Country is not as somber of a tone as Rare took, the kind of moodiness. It's a little bit more bombastic. It's a little bit more cartoony, a little bit not quite as slapsticky as DK64 was, but it's a middle ground between the two. And I feel like you could dial Lanky back just a little bit while retaining the core of his character. Get him in there, and he could be quite fun in a 2D environment if you switch him up enough to make him work there. So Lanky would be my first thought, my first and only thought, because while I'm sure there's a lot of elements from DK64 that you could then retrofit, no pun intended, into a Donkey Kong Country style game, you have to keep in mind.
Though.
Yeah, well, thank you. You have to keep in mind, too, that a lot of what Donkey Kong 64 already used were elements taken from Donkey Kong Country. So it's unless you really want to muddle it up.
I guess I'm imagining like a sort of Metroidvania style take on a Donkey Kong Country game where it's from a 2D perspective, but you go around these large maps looking for golden bananas.
Perhaps. Yeah. I feel like you definitely. I feel like there are too many collectibles in Retro's Donkey Kong Country games as is. Like too many puzzle pieces like per stage. I feel like it gets monotonous at times, whereas you look at the elegance of a Donkey Kong Country 2 or 3, where there's at most 3 bonus stages and they're all varied, and then you've got one premium collectible in the Hero Coin or DK Coin. I feel like that's the way to go. So I feel like any more of Donkey Kong 64 from the collectible aspect, I would want to stay away from, because I feel like there are already too many things to collect in Donkey Kong Country, the modern iterations as is. But I feel like maybe Yooka-Laylee and the Impossible Layer was a good middle ground, because you had the Twit coins. You had the Twit coins, but they were numbered, so there wasn't this like sense of, I don't know if I've missed it, where I missed it. He's like, you know exactly, like, oh, this is the 3rd Twit coin, but I didn't get number 2, so I know exactly between the where I would find it. So anyway, yeah, lanky. That's just a long-winded way of saying Lanky Kong.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of any other element from DK64 that would really fit well in a 2D game. I mean, I guess the other way to look at it would be in a 3D Donkey Kong game using elements of Donkey Kong Country Returns, but perhaps that sounds like a topic for another episode.
Yes, it definitely does, and I'm sure we'll talk about it at some point. All right, let's take the next call.
Hello, Kongversation. This is Keith Stat calling in. I just have to say that it is absolutely absurd to compare the generational divisions between Donkey Kong and Sonic the Hedgehog. When Sonic the Hedgehog made the jump to 3D, they changed the color of his eyes from black to green. Green! Could you even imagine the amount of strife and inner turmoil you would experience if they just arbitrarily changed the color of, say, Diddy Kong's eyes in his 3D debut? I think not.
Thank you, Keith, for the excellent point that put us in our place.
And you know what? You are damn right. Diddy Kong in DK64 is not the real Diddy Kong, goddammit. I can't believe that all these little DK64 fans want to come rising up out of the woodwork trying to tell us that that's Diddy Kong. He has a voice and it's this squeaky hoo-hoo. Come on, people. You think that's what Diddy Kong's supposed to be? Really? Really?
Well, you're a fake fan, Josh, because everybody knows Diddy Kong's blue-eyed, squeaky voice debut was Diddy Kong Racing 2 years before Donkey Kong 64. I grew up with Diddy Kong Racing, and then Donkey Kong 64 came out and steamrolled my childhood? No, thank you. No. Diddy Kong has a go-kart, a plane, or a hovercraft attached to his person at all times. What is this rocket barrel? He can fly with a plane. Why put a rocket barrel on him? And a peanut pop gun? 2 peanut pop guns? When he can just get missiles from a balloon? You don't even know Diddy Kong, Rare.
Thank you for the call, Keith.
Thank you for the call. What if Sonic got an extra finger in a golf? Okay, sorry. Just thinking about all the possibilities now. Let's take the last call.
Hey guys, this is Rick. I just wanted to call in and firstly give my appreciation to the Geek Critique for really getting me into the DK universe through his videos, and in turn getting me into DK Vine. That series was great, and I really enjoyed them. But, yeah, on the topic, my Sonic fandom kind of started and ended with the Adventure series, the Adventure era, I should say. I have great appreciation for the 2D games and the boost gameplay, but none of them really just ever clicked with me. But, yeah, I'm very interested to see what DK is going to be when it inevitably comes back. Like, I'm sure y'all have already discussed every possible outcome, but Will it be a new 2D series and a third developer? Kind of not. I doubt it. Maybe go back to 3D. Maybe be a 3D platformer, a 3D beat 'em up. I don't know. I don't really know what I want either. Well, I know I want Kongs. I know I love the Kong family and Animal Buddies, and so as long as they're all there, I'm sure whatever we get will be great. And yeah, thanks guys. Have a great one.
Well, thank you for the call, Rick, and I guess thank you, Josh, for getting him towards DK Vine.
I think the best direction that we could go in for the next DK game is, okay, Donkey Kong is the only playable character, but hear me out. Let me clarify here. At nighttime, Donkey Kong transforms into a were-Kong. And he gets angrier eyebrows and becomes physically larger, and all of his limbs become stretchy. So, during the daytime, you play through linear platforming stages in the vein of Donkey Kong Country Returns, maybe with, except now, you know how traditionally in Donkey Kong Country, when you press the run button, you'll roll. Now, when you hold down that button, you just roll at like 475 miles per hour constantly, and you don't stop. However, at nighttime, you play as stretchy-armed were-Kong Donkey Kong in a beat-em-up while jazz music plays. I think that's where they're going to go next.
You know, when we said we would discuss our ideas for a new 3D Donkey Kong game down the line, I didn't realize it would be 3 minutes down the line.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I think, and I don't know, like, I don't think it will necessarily be a 2D Donkey Kong game, a Donkey Kong Country style game, just because I don't feel like they're going to immediately do another one right after Retro. I feel like it's going to be a new direction. I feel like 3D would probably be the way they would go, not necessarily styled like Donkey Kong 64. It would be a new 3D direction, and maybe something to differentiate it from something like Odyssey. But I don't know. And I could be wrong, could just be a 2D game. I think it will definitely incorporate quite a bit from the Country series. Mm-hmm. I think it might even have the Country branding in the West, at least. But I don't know.
In all honesty, what would the style of 3D Donkey Kong that would make me personally the happiest would be if we finally got what was promised in that 1999 Insider Nintendo Power VHS tape that was part of the fabric of my childhood and that you hated. We've talked about that last time I was on, I think.
Oh, yes.
And that is, what that guy said was, so it's the same old Donkey Kong Country, but in 3D.
You want to talk about a generational divide in the same decade, the 5 years difference between 94 and 99.
Yeah.
Evident comparing the two VHS tapes released for those respective games. You had the height of 90s extreme grunge, and then you had the short hair, slicked up polo shirts. Yeah, it's just like, oh my god, this is the same decade. Like, this is one is like visibly more 90s than the other, but for some people the one from 99 would be the 90s one. So anyway,
yeah. But yeah, like, I think that this is something that DK Vine like investigated like 19 years ago now in a feature called Crash and Kong Strange Bedfellows. And I'm sorry to bring that up.
I don't even know who wrote. Was that Andre who wrote that one?
I don't quite remember, but
it wasn't me. But that sounds like an Andre title, for sure. Yeah, I agree. No, I agree. And we do know that was the original plan for Donkey Kong 64. Mm-hmm. The team just couldn't get it to work. And, you know, we talked a little bit about this on the episode about Donkey Kong 64 we did last November, Josh. The Stampers eventually came in and said, nah, this isn't working. We're pulling the plug. make it like Banjo-Kazooie.
Yeah.
just
yeah, like
get it out the door.
The modern video game industry is like it's missing 3D platformers of all kinds. And when you talk about wanting to differentiate it from Mario Odyssey, like I think that one of the best ways to do that would be to make it a more linear focused 3D platformer, you know, in the vein of like what the Crash Bandicoot series was.
Yeah, I feel like the original vision of Donkey Kong 64, had they been able to pull it off, it would have been the ideal. But they couldn't get it to work, especially on the N64.
Yeah.
So I think that doing it now, and you say Crash Bandicoot style, we don't want just a one-to-one clone of Crash Bandicoot. It would obviously be its own thing. But yeah, like have these relatively short levels in comparison to the sprawling 3D worlds, have them be 3D environments, but that are more linear, action-based, you know, a lot of swinging on vines and ropes and you know,
like barrel rolling off of ledges, like the sort of like the momentum and the drum-like rhythm that you can get into through a Donkey Kong Country stage, like doing that in a 3D environment. Oh,
barrel
my
cannons,
God, that could be amazing.
Yeah, like smashing walls and finding secrets, you know, secret entrances, and
yeah,
you could do a lot with that, and that would be, I think, what I would want to see, and I think that would be the direction to take it. So it's like these aren't the retro games. This isn't just another 2D platformer, and this is something a little bit different, especially different from Nintendo, which would be the important thing. Something they haven't really done. At least to my knowledge, from my remembrance,
and you know, then you having this 3D engine would also let you more easily and more naturally incorporate some story scenes, some storytelling through subtext, you know, things like that.
But I'm also like of two minds, because as much as I want that, I would also love a sandbox game. Just
of course,
Donkey Kong Island, sandbox it. You know, like give me freedom, give me complete control, and be able to go anywhere, just immerse myself in Donkey Kong's world. One of those.
And to tie this back to the other topic of the episode, I love this little piece of trivia. Early in the development of Crash Bandicoot, before they had a character design, before they had a name, they very quickly realized that whatever they went with, if they made a mascot platformer from a 3D perspective, the camera was going to be focused on the character's back end the entire time throughout gameplay. So the prototype of Crash Bandicoot was simply called Sonic's Ass.
And as a Donkey Kong fan, I can appreciate when a video game protagonist has a nice ass. It's actually what I look for first. Alright, so I just want to check the live stream comments real quick. See if there's anything pertinent there. Cameron is in a live stream, our own Cameron Regal, and he says, Diddy's eyes have been 4 different colors. Get on his level, Sonic. That's...
They've been blue, black, and brown. What's the other one?
Yeah, what's the other one? Because they've been, the little black pupils, they've been blue. They were brown in Smash Brothers, right?
I think that sounds right.
Cameron's counting gray. Okay.
I see.
Well, okay.
He also says the person who wrote the Crash article was in fact Ozzy Ben.
Ozzy Ben, okay.
And man, like, honestly, that article, I haven't read it in a long time, but that was kind of one of those points where I was like, you know, maybe Mario 64 isn't the only way that a Nintendo game should be 3D. Like, I remember that I thought that was a really cool article.
Kara says, geez, Hyle, you misogynist, girls can blaze it too. Yeah, sorry about that.
No, I think like the reason Blaze the Cat is like such a popular character among like across generations is just that she is quite atypical. She's a cool character in the vein of Sonic, but she sort of has like the stoic personality of like a Samus.
I obviously don't know Blaze the Cat, so I'm just nodding.
Right.
I'm saying, yeah, what a cool character Blaze is. I
At one point you during the episode you referred to modern Sonic as Lanky Sonic, and I wanted to make some sort of a there was a joke to be made there about modern Sonic being inflated just like a balloon, and then I realized, wait, no, there's way too much fan art of that out there.
Captain Cheesebag says, okay, so how about the next DKC game is literally Generations? It takes place 20 years after 64, where the main characters are Donkey's son, Diddy's daughter, and Chunky and Kitty's adopted child.
See, when you said Donkey Kong Generations, my brain obviously makes it like Sonic Generations, where modern 3D rendered polygonal Donkey Kong teams up with ACM graphics Super Nintendo Donkey Kong. And they're treated as two different characters.
No, but then throw in the 8-bit sprite of Cranky Kong, young Cranky Kong as well. And then to make it even more worrisome, his actions affect modern day Cranky Kong's memories. So modern day Cranky Kong is constantly like having seizures on the floor as new memories form in his brain. And yeah, let's do that. And then he just repeats the same level hints for the first world again and again and again as a result.
Just Andre wants to know what the other 3D Sonic gameplay style was, along with Adventure, Boost, and Lost World. The other one was Heroes.
Well, there's 5, as we've established.
Yes.
3D Blast. Pay respect to 3D Blast.
I mean, 3D Blast was probably the Sonic game that had the most in common with DK64, because you wander around gigantic stages looking for stuff.
Well, I know, like, they were kind of inspired by the graphical design of Donkey Kong Country. It has a vaguely Super Mario RPG sheen to it.
It has the isometric perspective and the pre-rendered graphics.
Yeah, but I just remember it came out, what was it, 96?
96, yeah.
Yeah, and I remember just being vaguely jealous of it. It's like, oh man, Sonic's got a 3D game before Donkey Kong.
Dude, like, I was I was 8 years old. My Sonic fandom was at its absolute apex. I would have loved, you'd think, anything that they came out with. I got Sonic 3D Blast for Christmas, and I don't think I ever made it past like the 3rd level, because I was like, well, this isn't very good.
Oh, that's disappointing.
What I'm telling you is, it's fine that you were jealous, but you weren't missing out on much.
Yeah, but I beat Donkey Kong Country Barrel Maze, Josh. Like,
true.
I don't care how off-putting a game is. If it's Donkey Kong, I will try to see it through to the end. Donkey Kong 2, I would have it beaten if I just had a partner for 2-player gorilla duet. You know, like. I
think I've offered you this before. I'd do it. I played quite a bit of Donkey Konga.
I know, we just have to like play it in different rooms, unfortunately, with the quarantine.
Captain Cheesebag wanted to know what 3D category I'd put Shadow in. I'd say it's more of an adventure. It plays more like Adventure 2 does than Heroes. Heroes, I think, is defined by the 3-character dynamic and switching between different characters, and all of whom have different movesets. Shadow is, more of an adventure style game, although the progression system and the mission system certainly gives it quite a different flavor.
All right, well, I say we wrap this episode up. And I want to share a little anecdote really quick about the passing of generations and how mind-blowing it can be when you hit a certain age. And I haven't shared this anecdote, I don't believe. When I was at MagFest, obviously Cameron and I, we hosted our 20 years of the Donkey Kong Universe panel, which is now up on MagFest YouTube channel, so check that out. It's an hour
you guys
long.
Did a great job. I wish I could have been there.
Oh, thank you. Much breezier than the Kongversation. But we hit all these succinct points, so thank you again, Cameron, for doing that with me. Back when we had things like conventions, back in the before times. Mm-hmm. But a lot of people approached me throughout the day after we did that, who had been in attendance. And obviously it was Donkey Kong themed anyway, so like it was just in the air. But the whole convention was themed after Donkey Kong. But I remember being approached and like, yeah, I really played the hell out of DK Jungle Climber for the Nintendo DS. Like that was my Donkey Kong game. And I was like, what? Like, I love Jungle Climber, right? But to me, that is such the quintessential side game. That is like, that is just like this, like, almost secret handshake in the community. Like, oh yeah, DK Jungle Climber, like on the same level as Pocket Tales, right? But to this person, they had a Nintendo DS. That was their, I think, only video game system, they said, and that was the only Donkey Kong game they knew. So for them, Donkey Kong was DK Jungle Climber. Donkey Kong is a peg swinging series. And that was just so crazy to me. And it really did make me think back then to that supervisor I had at that retail job back in 2004 who said, like, Mario versus Donkey Kong, that is the real Donkey Kong. And I was like, you know what? This is all a matter of perspective. There is no real Donkey Kong. The real Donkey Kong is what we make of it. And we kind of just have to all understand each other's viewpoints and understand that to most people in this hobby, in this fandom, and in this collective of fandoms, the true version is always going to be that version when you're 12 years old or 10 years old or 8 years old, whatever. When you really fall in love with something for the first time, that's going to be your true version. And nothing that comes along after the fact or like a half decade after or 20 years after, nothing is ever going to match that. Nothing is ever going to hit that sweet spot quite the same again. And that sucks. That really does suck sometimes because you're like, I peaked at 12. But, you kind of have to deal with that. It's the ugly truth of growing up that you will always have that experience. You will always have that game or that property or that thing you love the most when you were a kid. That can't be taken from you unless it was like maybe a mobile game that's no longer downloadable and there are no like emulated versions of it.
But even then, the memories can't be taken from you.
Unless you have Alzheimer's, but...
Oh, no.
By and large, you'll always have that. And you can always share that with future generations, so long as you don't belittle what they love in the process.
And I would... Go ahead.
Oh, I was done. I was just stammering.
Okay, well, I would just to build on that a little bit, like, just because the thing that you loved when you were 12 is not exactly, it is changed just because it's different, just because it looks different, just because the tone is different, just because the gameplay is different. Like, that doesn't mean that there's not still something in there worth experiencing or worth playing or worth loving or at least worth examining. Like, I would say that like nostalgia is powerful, and believe me, I get that, but it shouldn't stop you from being able to appreciate or even enjoy like a whole new take on a series or a character that you loved. Just right. Like, people, I think, especially in the Sonic fandom, but in plenty of other fandoms, sometimes act like, because we are now getting this version of the character, what I grew up with no longer matters or no longer exists or is no longer valid, and the series can never possibly recover from it. Basically, it's like, if Sonic is classic Sonic, that's all he can be, and that's all that exists, and that's all that's going to come out. And I think that worry is where a lot of this consternation comes from. But you need, like, it's okay to kind of reach out and reach across the fandom and try to understand where people are coming from and try to enjoy things like, on some level that you thought you might not. Because
Yeah.
I played Sonic Lost World for the first time in about 6 years last month, and I still didn't love it, but I enjoyed it a hell of a lot more than I did the first time, because I wasn't ascribing such impossibly high expectations onto it.
And that's really what it is, expectations. And, you know, for something like Mario versus Donkey Kong, it's never really going to do much for me because it is so opposed to what I really love about Donkey Kong, where Donkey Kong is the protagonist, you know, where, you know, it's really set in his world, and it's the celebration of his community and friends and loved ones and environment, and it just, everything from the gameplay down doesn't appeal to me, but I can respect people who that is their Donkey Kong, and I can also appreciate little various aspects of it, like, oh yeah, you know, it's funny that, you know, Donkey Kong and Mario fought again, or in this case, it fought for the first time since he was junior, allegedly, and, you know, maybe I can come up with a clever fan wank to make it work, to make it all, you know, consistent with my understanding of Donkey Kong. So I'll just say, you know, Mario's toy commercial had subliminal advertising in it that effectively brainwashed Donkey Kong into acting.
That is one of my
character.
favorite fan winks you've ever done right there.
Well, you know, and it's just like, that way I can still appreciate it for what it is without viewing it as, oh, it must be, we must strike it from canon. I never want anything struck from canon. Like, I see so many people. I'm going to bring up Star Wars again really quick. Sure. I don't care if you don't like the newer movies, the sequels, the most recent trilogy, because, you know, yeah, you know, if they don't appeal to you, or if you find the story was sloppy or whatever, and just, you know, inconsistent in tone or whatever, fine. But I see fans like, oh, Disney must strike it from the continuity and do it over again. Like, no. Like, what are you talking about? Because I guarantee you, like, there are kids out there, those were their first Star Wars movies, and they love them, and they have no idea that there's an entire older generation of fans who are railing against them. It was the same thing with the prequels. As much as I dislike the prequels.
That's the crazy thing. It's going to happen to them, too. 20 years ago, the kids who grew up with the original trilogy were saying, I'm sure some of them were talking about wanting to strike the prequels from canon, that these aren't real Star Wars movies. And, and the people now who are coming down so hard on the new trilogy, and to be clear, I don't have a dog in this fight. I've never been a Star Wars fan, but I've always found it interesting.
Exactly.
Like, 10 years from now, the kids who are getting into Star Wars via this new trilogy now are gonna, like, they're gonna have that exact same reaction when they realize, oh my god, wait, a whole generation of people who are now legally adults absolutely love this thing that I've always hated. What the hell?
Yeah, this is wrong. This is what is wrong with kids today. And then we get into the whole generational war. Maybe this is the root of boomers versus millennials. Maybe it's just like they don't properly respect MASH enough. I don't know. But
time makes boomers of us all, Hyle.
This has been a File 2 production.
Que rico.